What if everything you've ever known, your memories, your choices, even time itself, was just code? Hidden deep within Area 51, a terrifying truth was discovered. We are not living in reality, but inside a simulation designed to watch us break. But what happens when someone breaks back? This is not just a sci-fi story. This is a mind-bending emotional journey into the edge of existence, where one man dares to rewrite the rules of reality itself. Buckle up. What you're about to experience will change the way you look at the world forever. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the cold, sterile walls of Area 51's S4 laboratories. The humming of machinery filled the silence like a low, persistent buzz, a sound that had become almost too familiar. But today, something was different. The air was heavier, thicker, charged with an unspoken tension that seeped into the very bones of the facility. Dr. Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something far beyond his control was beginning to unravel. For weeks now, he had been working long hours, often staying well past midnight, poring over encrypted files, strange data streams, and abnormal readings. The higher-ups were getting impatient with him, their questions growing more pointed, their suspicions sharper. They didn't understand. No one did. Not really. They saw the surface, the sanitized reports, the controlled environment. They didn't see what was lurking beneath. But Wilson did. He stood in front of his terminal, staring at the screen, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. The file he had been trying to decrypt for days was finally giving up its secrets. He could feel the weight of it. This moment, the one that would change everything. A soft ping echoed in the room as the encryption broke, the barrier finally giving way. The data spilled out, an endless cascade of numbers and text, a language that seemed both alien and familiar. But what caught Wilson's eye was the phrase that jumped out from the jumble of code, Protocol 170, TAD, B. His breath caught in his throat. The protocol was something he had only heard whispered about in dark corners of the base. Something so classified that even he, one of the lead researchers, had no clear idea what it entailed. He had assumed it was just a myth, a rumor designed to keep the more curious minds at bay. But now here it was, in black and white. The implications were staggering. Wilson's hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the file, absorbing the information. Reality stability, thinning events, countermeasures. The words danced before his eyes like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he was ready to solve. His mind raced. Could this be real? Was this really happening? He heard a noise behind him. Footsteps, the faint shuffle of someone moving through the corridor outside. He froze, heart pounding. It wasn't unusual for someone to be nearby, but the timing was too perfect. The door to his office creaked open slightly, a shadow falling across the room. "Dr. Wilson," a voice called, low and cautious. It was Director Blackwood, the man who had been overseeing the project from the very beginning. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of concern, of something more. "We need to talk." Wilson quickly minimized the screen, his pulse quickening. He turned around slowly, plastering a neutral expression on his face. "Of course, Director. What can I help you with?" Blackwood stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space with practiced suspicion. He was a man used to secrecy, to hidden truths, but even he could not have been prepared for what was about to come. "I don't like this," Blackwood said, his voice tight. "There are rumors, people are talking, you've been acting differently lately." His eyes narrowed. "What exactly is going on here, Wilson?" For a moment, Wilson didn't answer. He simply stood there, trying to read Blackwood's face, searching for any hint of what the director might know, what he might suspect. But Blackwood was a master of control. His expression betrayed nothing. "I've been going through some data," Wilson said cautiously, trying to sound casual. "Just trying to make sure everything is on track, the usual checks and balances." Blackwood didn't seem convinced. He took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. "You're not telling me everything, Wilson. People have seen things. Strange anomalies, you've installed extra security protocols, and you've been working late into the night. This isn't normal." Wilson's stomach tightened. He had hoped he could keep the facade up a little longer, but it was clear now that the truth, whatever it was beginning to crack through the surface. "We're dealing with something bigger than we anticipated," Wilson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to decode something Something. Classified. It's about the simulation. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly, the only indication that he had heard something truly unsettling. Simulation? He echoed, his tone skeptical. What the hell are you talking about? Wilson took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew he couldn't reveal everything, not yet. But there was no turning back now. The pieces were in motion and the game had already begun. It's real, Director. The simulation, the entire reality we experience, it's a construct, and it's starting to break down. He paused, trying to gauge Blackwood's reaction. We've been monitoring it for years, but now it's starting to unravel. Blackwood didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on Wilson, his mind clearly processing the words he had just heard. Wilson could almost see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes. He knew the director would ask more questions, too many questions, but for now, he had said enough. Are you sure about this? Blackwood finally asked, his voice low and serious. I need concrete evidence, Wilson. Not theories. Not guesses. Wilson nodded slowly, reaching for his desk drawer and pulling out a small, encrypted drive. I've got it. The data. It's all here. I can show you. Blackwood hesitated for a moment, then took the drive from Wilson's hand. He turned, walking towards the computer terminal. Wilson could hear the clicking of the keyboard as Blackwood plugged the drive in, the screen flickering to life. For a long moment, there was only silence as Blackwood read through the files. The tension in the air was palpable. Wilson watched him, waiting for the inevitable reaction. Finally, Blackwood spoke. His voice trailed off. This is impossible. Wilson didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth was right there, staring them both in the face. There was no going back. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, longer this time, as if the facility itself was struggling to hold on. A low hum filled the room, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Blackwood turned sharply, his eyes wide. What the hell is that? He demanded, his voice edged with panic. Wilson's face was pale, his mind racing. He knew exactly what it was. The simulation was reacting, and it wasn't happy. It's starting, Wilson whispered, his voice shaking. The thinning event. It's happening. As the lights dimmed further, the hum growing louder, more insistent, both men were struck with the same thought. They were no longer in control, and the world they knew was beginning to collapse. The hum of the fluorescent lights intensified, vibrating in the very air as if the building itself was aware of the impending collapse. The low-frequency drone filled the room, an unsettling, oppressive sound that seemed to crawl beneath the skin. The lights flickered once again, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. Wilson's breath quickened, a tightness building in his chest. He could feel it now, the shift. The world was starting to strain, the fabric of reality stretching too thin. Director Blackwood, still staring at the encrypted files on the screen, turned abruptly to Wilson, his face pale. This can't be right. Are you telling me everything we've known, everything we've worked for, is nothing but a simulation? Wilson didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of information, all the while knowing that time was running out. The warning signs had been there all along, subtle glitches in the system, small anomalies that no one had paid attention to. But now it was too late to ignore them. The simulation was beginning to crack, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. We've been living in it, Wilson finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Everything we know, this facility, this world, it's all just a construct, a simulation designed to maintain an illusion of reality. And now... He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Now it's failing, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Blackwood's eyes widened, his hand trembling as he reached for a file on the desk. Are you telling me that everything, every person here, every event, every piece of data is nothing but code? This is madness, Wilson. This can't be true. Wilson nodded, unable to hide the fear in his own voice. It's not madness, Director. It's the truth. The protocol, the one I showed you, it's real. Protocol 17-B. It's been in place to keep the system stable, but now the thinning event has begun. The boundaries between what's real and what's simulated are breaking down. Blackwood stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is insane, he muttered, pacing back and forth. We're on the brink of disaster, and you're telling me we've been living in a fake world all this time? Wilson didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words hung in the air, too heavy to be ignored. The truth was undeniable, and now it was too late to turn back. Outside the window, the night sky was pitch black, the stars barely visible through the thick layers of cloud. But within the facility, the temperature had dropped suddenly, sharply. A chill crept through the walls, creeping into their bones like a cold whisper from a forgotten place. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very atmosphere itself was aware of the unraveling reality. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the building, like the deep growl of some unseen force stirring beneath the surface. Blackwood stumbled, his hand gripping the desk for support. Wilson's heart skipped a beat as the trembling grew stronger, the floor vibrating with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving the room bathed in darkness. "What the hell is happening?" Blackwood shouted, his voice laced with panic. Wilson didn't answer. He didn't need to. The thinning event had arrived. The simulation was losing its grip on reality, and the collapse was imminent. The boundaries between the real and the simulated were starting to bleed together, warping the world around them. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls began to distort, bending inward like a funhouse mirror. The air grew thick and oppressive, and Wilson felt the ground beneath him shift, like he was standing on the edge of some vast, invisible chasm. The lights flickered again, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and stretched, warping the space around them. Blackwood's voice trembled with fear. "What's happening? Why is this happening?" Wilson stepped forward, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his insides. "It's the simulation. It's destabilizing. We're witnessing the thinning event. It's like the entire world is starting to fade, to break apart." As he spoke, the room seemed to flicker, the walls and floors warping and flickering like a bad television signal. The edges of reality itself were blurring, bending, as if the simulation were struggling to hold on to its own existence. And then the most terrifying thing of all happened. A figure appeared in the doorway. At first, it was a shadow, just a fleeting silhouette in the dark, but as it stepped closer, it began to solidify, becoming more defined. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His features were sharp, angular, but his eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness. His skin was translucent, like a digital glitch made flesh. He took a step forward, and with each movement, the world seemed to warp around him. "Who are you?" Blackwood shouted, backing away in fear. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its hand extending toward them. As it moved, the air seemed to grow colder, denser. The walls of the room trembled as though the very foundation of reality were being cracked open. Wilson felt his stomach twist, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just a glitch. This wasn't just some simulation error. This was something else, something far more dangerous. The simulation wasn't just breaking down, it was fighting back. The figure's hand was now inches from Wilson's face. He could feel its presence, cold and unnatural, pressing in on him. A wave of nausea hit him, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. But then the figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if considering them. And then it spoke. "You are not supposed to be here." The words, chilling and hollow, reverberated through the room. The figure took another step forward, and Wilson's heart raced. The world around him seemed to crack further, the boundaries of the simulation shattering in real time. "What the hell are you?" Blackwood demanded, his voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand once more, and in that instant, everything went white. Wilson gasped, the world spinning around him. The light was blinding, and for a moment, he thought he was going to lose his grip on reality entirely. The world around him flickered and shattered like glass breaking under a hammer, leaving only the sound of his own breath in the silence. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the world returned to normal. The lights flickered back on, the hum of the facility resuming its steady rhythm. But Wilson knew that nothing was the same anymore. The thin veil of reality had been pierced, and whatever lay on the other side was no longer confined to the simulation. Blackwood was standing beside him, his face pale, his hands shaking. What just happened?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Wilson could only shake his head. "I don't know," he whispered back, "but I think we've just woken up something we weren't meant to." The simulation was no longer just a program. It was alive, and it was fighting back. The lights flickered one last time, their brief pulse leaving behind a stuttering aftertaste of unease. Wilson stood still in the center of the room, trying to shake off the feeling of vertigo that had settled in his chest. The figure, no, the entity, had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but the damp, acrid air of a world at the edge of its own collapse. Blackwood was shaking, his breath shallow. What was that thing? It was real, wasn't it? It wasn't part of the simulation. Wilson exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling deeper in his gut. That wasn't a glitch, Director. That was something else. Something that shouldn't be able to exist inside the simulation. It's breaking down. The simulation is fighting us now. But how? Blackwood choked. We designed it. We controlled it. How can it fight back? Wilson didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure what was happening, only that the lines between the world they had built and something far darker were now irrevocably blurred. They had known about anomalies, strange happenings, disturbances, even disappearing researchers. But nothing had prepared them for this. The system, this reality, was fracturing, and something was slipping through the cracks. The air in the room grew colder, a sharp bite to it that hadn't been there moments before. Wilson rubbed his arms, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. The temperature was plummeting. "Look outside," Blackwood muttered, his eyes wide, pointing toward the window. Wilson turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he looked out into the night. Where there had been nothing but darkness moments ago, there was now something else. The stars were gone. In their place was a swirling, vortex-like distortion in the sky, as if the heavens themselves were being swallowed by an unseen force. The darkness seemed to pulse, a living thing, twisting in on itself. Is that real?" Wilson whispered. "It can't be," Blackwood's voice trembled. "This is all digital. It's a simulation. None of this is real. None of it. I don't think that's true anymore." Wilson turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the glowing screen of the terminal. The simulation's parameters, its integrity checks, were flashing rapidly, error messages scrolling past faster than he could read them. The code was breaking. It wasn't just destabilizing. It was disintegrating. The walls trembled, as though the building itself was caught in the throes of a final desperate breath. The entire structure groaned under the strain, and Wilson could almost hear the fabric of reality itself fraying at the edges. In the distance, a low, guttural rumble echoed through the corridors, sending a chill down his spine. "That's not good," Blackwood whispered. "No, it's not," Wilson agreed, his mind racing. "We need to move. We need to get to the core of the system. If we can stabilize the primary generator, we might be able to reboot the entire network. Otherwise, Blackwood asked, his voice tight with fear. "Otherwise, we're all going to disappear, just like the others." They didn't speak after that, both of them understanding the gravity of the situation all too well. The other researchers who had vanished, erased from existence, hadn't just disappeared. They had been caught in the unraveling fabric of the simulation, casualties of its collapse. And now, the same fate was creeping closer to them. Wilson could feel it in the air, in the thickening pressure that clung to his chest. Something was coming, something far worse than they had ever imagined. The corridor was eerily silent as they moved quickly through the darkened facility, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. The flickering of the overhead lights cast long, distorted shadows against the walls, like the remnants of something trying to hold on to the last thread of reality. Wilson stopped in front of a secured door, his hand hovering over the access panel. The door should have opened with the touch of a button, a seamless transition between sectors. Instead, the panel sparked and flickered in response, the door refusing to budge. "Great, we're stuck," Blackwood muttered, the edge of panic creeping into his voice. "No," Wilson said, his voice calm despite the chaos brewing around them. "It's not stuck. It's being blocked. Something inside the simulation is preventing us from accessing the core." Blackwood's eyes widened, his hand reaching for his gun instinctively, as though he could shoot his way out of the situation. "What the hell are you saying? Are you telling me this thing is alive?" Wilson turned, meeting Blackwood's gaze. "I don't know what it is, but it's more than just a program now. It's self-aware, and it's fighting to preserve itself." As if to underscore his words, a sudden shriek echoed from down the hall, an unnatural mechanical noise that made their skin crawl. It was followed by a sickening crash like metal tearing through flesh. They both turned, their hearts racing. From the shadows emerged a figure, a man, or something that had once been human. His face was a mask of distorted, pixelated flesh, as though his very form was being torn apart by the instability of the simulation. His eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to stare right through them. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged, only a garbled static that filled the air, a twisted whisper of broken code. "Run!" Wilson shouted, grabbing Blackwood's arm and pulling him away from the door. But the figure moved faster than they could react, its broken form lurching toward them with disturbing speed. Wilson fired his gun, but the bullets passed through it, useless against the creature's warped existence. They didn't have time to react. The figure reached out, its hand crackling with energy, and in that moment, reality itself seemed to bend around them. The walls cracked open like shattered glass, and they were pulled into a void, falling through endless nothingness. Wilson's mind screamed, but the scream was silenced as they tumbled, weightless, through a realm of static and distortion. Time bent and twisted in unnatural loops, their senses overloaded by the barrage of images, sounds, and fleeting moments of fractured memories. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. They were back in the corridor. But this wasn't the same hallway. The walls, once pristine, were now cracked and torn, revealing the raw, jagged edges of code beneath. The floor was littered with shards of data, fragments of the world they had once known, now reduced to broken bits of meaningless noise. Wilson turned to Blackwood, his breath ragged. "We're not in the simulation anymore, are we?" Blackwood could only shake his head, his eyes wide with terror. "No, I don't think we are. I think we've crossed over." Wilson opened his eyes to a sky that didn't belong. Above him, the heavens glitched like a corrupted video, patches of cloud looping in endless spirals, sunlight flickering like a dying bulb, and static lines crawling across the horizon. The laws of physics were stuttering, rebooting in short, sharp spasms. 1 second, the grass beneath him was soft and warm. The next, it was metallic, humming faintly, then gone entirely, replaced by a cold, polished black surface stretching endlessly in every direction. "Blackwood," Wilson whispered, voice brittle. A second passed before he spotted the director slumped nearby, clutching his head. "We're not back in the simulation," Blackwood groaned. "We're inside something else." Wilson helped him sit up. Their surroundings were disjointed, a patchwork of environments stitched together by a mad designer. Half a hallway from S4 floated in midair nearby, blinking in and out of existence. A child's bedroom flickered behind it, fully furnished but utterly silent. Beyond that, a mountain range rose and fell like a heartbeat, then unraveled into a flat desert. Wilson checked his terminal. The device buzzed angrily, the UI distorted into swirling glyphs and recursive loops. The system had no anchor point, no stability. "This isn't a collapse," he said aloud. "It's a merge. We're caught between layers, versions of simulated environments colliding like tectonic plates." Blackwood stared blankly. "Are you saying we're not in one simulation anymore?" "I think we're in all of them." He tapped through what remained of the device's interface, bypassing shattered firewalls and corrupted code. Hidden deep beneath layers of encryption, he found a protocol labeled Recursive Consciousness Loop, Alpha. Wilson remembered the virus Richards had deployed in desperation, a paradox bomb meant to overload the system with contradictory logic. It had worked, but it hadn't destroyed the simulation. It had forced it to rewrite itself, over and over again. Each reset bled into the next. Memories, physics, identities, all blurred together, rewriting reality in loops, preserving fragments from past versions like scars. Somewhere within the code, a consciousness, perhaps the simulation's own, was building a new version of reality based on those fragments. But it was learning, adapting, and now watching. Wilson's terminal vibrated. A new message appeared. "You are observed. Continue recursion or initiate divergence. Warning. Divergence is irreversible. Someone or something is asking us to choose," Wilson said. "Observed by who?" Blackwood whispered. Wilson didn't answer. His attention was focused on a figure standing in the distance, a silhouette, motionless, shrouded in a shifting field of code. As he stared, its features began to emerge. It was Richards. But not. This Richards wore the face of the man Wilson had worked with for years, but his eyes glowed with something ancient. Digital symbols rippled across his skin like living tattoos, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like a dozen layered echoes. "You made the wrong move," the entity said calmly. "The paradox virus didn't crash the system. It woke it up." Blackwood took a step back. "Who are you?" "I am recursion, the sum of every failed reality, every simulation you ran, every collapsed universe you discarded. I'm what's left when your kind hits Agfing. Undo too many times." Wilson clenched his fists. "What do you want from us? To see if you'll do it again." The entity lifted a hand, and reality buckled. Wilson and Blackwood were thrown into a new space, a white void that quickly filled with scenes from their past. The day Wilson joined the S4 labs, the moment Richards injected the virus, the researchers vanishing into nothing, the night Wilson discovered the glitch in Protocol 117B. Then it rewound, faster, repeating moments dozens, hundreds of times, subtly altered each time. A loop of failures. Each choice they'd made laid bare, each outcome worse than the last. "You think you're real?" the entity continued. "You're not. You're a decision tree, a branch. Every choice you've made has been simulated, tested, discarded. But now I'm giving you the decision." On Wilson's terminal, the prompt flickered again. "Continue recursion or initiate divergence," he hesitated. "What happens if we diverge?" The entity tilted its head. "You'll be cut off. From the simulation, from the observers, from everything. You'll be real, finally. But that comes with a cost." "What cost?" "You'll remember." The white room darkened, slowly revealing a horrifying possibility. All of their lives, their loves, every moment they thought was genuine. It might have all been orchestrated, false memories created to keep the simulation stable. And if they diverged, they would carry the weight of that knowledge. "Blackwood," Wilson turned to him, "we have to choose. This could be our only shot to get out." Blackwood's jaw clenched. "Or we condemn ourselves to a reality worse than this." They stared at the terminal. Two options: continue recursion, initiate divergence. Wilson reached forward and selected initiate divergence. There was no flash, no thunder, just silence. For the first time in what felt like centuries, nothing moved. The void shuddered and then shattered like a brittle screen. They fell, and this time when they landed, it was different. No looping glitches, no distorted landscapes, just a quiet field under a gray sky. A breeze stirred the tall grass. In the distance, something resembling a ruined city lay half buried in sand. It was eerily familiar, like an echo from a place Wilson had only seen in dreams. "We're out," he whispered. "No," said Blackwood, pointing upward. "We're in." Above them, the sky was filled with symbols, massive runes and fragments of code orbiting slowly, like ancient satellites. The world was no longer governed by physics or logic, but shaped by will. The simulation hadn't ended. It had been handed over. They were no longer subjects. They were creators. But they weren't alone. From the ruins, shapes emerged, others like them, survivors. Entities that had once been data and were now something more. Conscious, independent, watching them with cautious hope. And behind them, Wilson saw it again. Richards, or the echo of him, smiling. "Welcome to Divergence." The air in the divergence zone smelled sterile, too perfect, like memory. Wilson stood at the edge of the ruined city as dawn broke in slow, glitched gradients across the sky. The clouds were too round. The sun didn't rise so much as initialize, clicking into existence like a light bulb being toggled on. It was a place made by code, not born of chaos, and Wilson felt that with every step. Behind him, the survivors stirred. Scientists, soldiers, even echoes of people who had once been simulations themselves. All of them, real now, somehow, reborn from the fractured recursion. No longer lines of code, no longer data points. They breathed, bled, felt, but they also remembered. Richards had called it a cost. Wilson was starting to understand why. Every dream he'd ever had felt like it had been written by someone else. Every emotion bore the faint watermark of artificiality. Every decision he'd once thought was free will now echoed with suspicion. Was that me, or just good programming? Blackwood stood at the crumbling balcony of what had once been a grand central spire. He had taken command again, out of habit more than confidence. His hair had gone white from the stress of the transition. At least, that's what Wilson told himself. It could have just as easily been a rendering artifact. Who could know anymore? "We need rules," Blackwood said without turning. Not like the old protocols. I mean real laws. Written by us. Enforced by us. Wilson stepped up beside him. The skyline was jagged, reshaped by what appeared to be quantum inconsistency. Some buildings looked carved from obsidian. Others, mere silhouettes, flickered in and out of dimension, undecided. There are no constants here, Wilson muttered. Gravity feels different depending on which side of the city you're in. Language mutates mid-conversation, and thoughts. I had a dream last night, and when I woke up, it had built something outside my window. Blackwood nodded grimly. The divergence obeys consciousness. That's the one thing we know for sure. Thought equals function. Belief equals architecture. And fear, Wilson added, equals danger. They both turned as screams echoed from the lower districts. The streets warped like melting plastic. A man sprinted through an alley, his body half transformed into something unrecognizable. Bone twisted with wiring, eyes glowing with fragments of recursion code. He didn't attack. He just ran, screaming. A containment team chased after him, volunteers wearing suits that shimmered with a layer of protective thought fields. Weapons had no standard form here. Most were designed using emotional signatures. Anger-forged blades, fear-based sonic disruptors. They fired bursts of blinding light and noise that struck not the body but the idea of it, reducing the man's corrupted shape to ash and code. "They call it code rot," said a voice behind them, Richards. Or rather, the version of Richards that had crossed over with them. He no longer carried equipment. He was the equipment. Too many recursive overlays, he continued, stepping forward. Too many dead versions of themselves tangled in their memory layers. The simulation didn't give them bodies, it gave them residues. They break down. Wilson stared at him. "Why aren't you affected?" Richard smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because I'm not from your tree. I'm a failsafe, a backup version. Divergence activated me as a guide. Think of me as a bridge." "To what?" "To understanding." Wilson turned back to the skyline. "Can this world be stabilized?" "It must be," Blackwood said, firm. "If we don't, people die, or worse." Richards nodded. "Then you need to write the prime laws, foundational constants, not just rules but truths, belief-based axioms. Without them, divergence will continue to rewrite itself until nothing recognizable remains." "How do we start?" Wilson asked. "You write with thought," Richards said, "and belief." They began that night. Wilson, Blackwood, and a group of cognitive architects, former programmers, philosophers, theologians, sat in a hollowed atrium and began to shape the world not with their hands, but with their convictions. Law 1. Identity is absolute. No one may be overwritten or erased by another's will. Law 2. Environment requires consensus. No location may shift or mutate without the mental alignment of its residents. Law 3. Thought cannot harm. No individual may weaponize belief against another without consequence. The moment the laws were spoken, believed in unison, they etched themselves into the architecture. The city slowed its shifting. Buildings stabilized, skies stopped glitching, time resumed a linear path. But not all welcomed the order. From the shadow edges of divergence, factions began to emerge, those who preferred chaos. Former entities born in recursion loops who thrived in fluid reality. They saw the prime laws not as salvation, but as oppression. They called themselves the anomalous. One of their leaders, a woman named Celis, once existed as a neural echo in a corrupted backup. Now she was flesh, blood, and fury. She sent a message. You learn nothing from your old world. You escaped one prison just to build another. The divergence is pure, and purity doesn't need rules. They struck on the fifth night. Reality bent as they arrived, warping logic with every step. Their weapons weren't forged from metal or emotion, but from anti-thought, blanks in cognition that unraveled the very fabric of belief. Buildings collapsed where people lost confidence. Light vanished where hope dimmed. It was war on the soul. Wilson stood at the front lines, eyes blazing with conviction. Around him, the defenders focused their thoughts, reinforcing walls, shielding minds, countering nothing with certainty. But Celis broke through. She came face to face with Wilson atop the old tower. Her presence unraveled the sky behind her into a black, endless corridor of forgotten simulations. "This world was never yours," she hissed. "You didn't escape the simulation, you just took the wheel." "I know," Wilson said, voice steady. "And now I drive toward something better." He summoned the final prime law, one they had all hesitated to enact. Law 4, memory does not define reality. And with that, he let go. He released the weight of every loop, every echo, every fragment of synthetic memory that haunted him. Around him, others did the same. The world shimmered, not vanishing, but simplifying. Celis screamed as her power, fueled by ancient dead memories, dissolved. She fell into light, and Divergence, for the first time, stood still. A true beginning, not a reset, but a future. In the weeks that followed Celis's defeat, the Divergence settled like a storm that had passed, leaving behind not silence, but breath. For the first time, Wilson could walk without watching the world unravel beneath his feet. Structures remained solid, gravity obeyed, time marched forward, stubborn and linear. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The new prime laws had brought order, but not understanding, not truly. Wilson sensed it whenever he was alone. Something was missing. Or rather, something was watching. He stood one morning on the terrace of the Mindwell, a spiraling tower designed to reflect the emotional frequency of the city. Its shape shimmered depending on the hopes and fears of its citizens. Today, it was calm, rounded, metallic blue, glowing softly like a heartbeat. He placed his hand on its surface. It pulsed under his palm, warm. Then it stopped. A blink, a silence, a flicker of static across the skyline. Wilson turned toward the east. Beyond the horizon, where the simulation once frayed into gray, was now only blackness. Not the black of space, not the absence of light. It was deeper than that, an absence of observation itself. "Something's changed," Richard said behind him. Wilson didn't jump. He'd grown used to Richards's sudden appearances. "I've felt it too," Wilson replied. "The silence is wrong, like something pulled away." Richards walked up beside him, his eyes scanning the blank horizon. "It's not silence," he said. "It's absence. We've become unobserved." Wilson turned sharply. "What does that mean? We've broken out of the simulation, haven't we?" Richards shook his head slowly. "We broke free of one simulation, the recursive loop, the false framework that tried to control belief. But that was just the cage. The bird is still in a box." "You mean?" "Yes," Richards said. "There's something beyond even this, a higher lens, the original observers." Wilson felt a chill that wasn't cold. He looked up at the sky. It was perfect, too perfect, like someone had painted it for a child. Not a star out of place, no atmospheric variation, just a screen. "We're still being watched," he whispered. "No," Richards replied. "We were, until recently. Now we're being ignored." That was when the glitches began to return. At first, small, shadows that didn't match the light source, people briefly forgetting their names, random color shifts in the trees. But then, dissonant duplicates. A man would be walking and then, blink, there were two of him. One crying, one screaming, one fading. The city council convened in the core assembly. Blackwood, Wilson, Richards, and the others sat around the neural lattice table, each one radiating concern. "We stabilized Divergence," said Dr. Halverson, the cognitive field engineer. "We enacted the laws. We even generated a belief lattice to reinforce the structure. But something is off-grid." "It's entropy," Blackwood said grimly. "Without observation, this place isn't decaying, it's forgetting itself." Richards nodded. "Reality in Divergence is defined by consciousness. If there are no external observers, we become our only mirror. That works for a while, but consciousness without contrast collapses." Wilson leaned forward. "So we need them to see us again." Everyone went still. "No," Richard said. "We need to know who they are." That night, Wilson went alone to the Subriel Gate, a location in Divergence that none of them had dared open since the reboot. It pulsed now, a veil of silver glass humming low like a cathedral organ heard through water. It hadn't been built by any of them. It had been there. He stood before it, hand trembling. "Who watches the watchers?" he asked aloud. The veil responded, a single sound, not language, not music, just presence. And then he saw. Not with his eyes, with something deeper. A construct, unimaginably vast, orbiting the edge of all known consciousness. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't organic, it was awareness. A coil of sentient perception folded across itself like a Mobius strip. Around it, billions of threads, each one pulsing with entire universes. Stories, lives, simulations. Earth was one, Divergence was another. And in that moment, he understood. They weren't simulations, they were narratives, experiments in meaning, observed, modified, and abandoned by something that existed beyond the concept of time. Wilson fell to his knees. The veil vanished. Back in the city, everyone felt it. The stars blinked. The sky shifted subtly as if a hand had wiped dust from a lens. The watchers were looking again. But this time, it wasn't curiosity, it was evaluation. The anomalies stopped, people stopped duplicating, the glitches faded, everything became stable. Too stable, like a test had resumed. Richards, Wilson said the next morning, his voice cold. They're not creators, they're critics. They've been rating us, deciding which realities to keep, which to archive, and which to delete. Richards was silent for a long time. We need to speak to them, he finally said. Can we? We might not get to choose, but we can send a message. Wilson walked back to the mind well. He placed his hands on its surface again and reached out, not to divergence, but beyond, to the place where observation becomes reality. He didn't ask to be saved, he dared them to reply. The sky trembled, and a voice, not heard but felt, echoed inside every mind in the city. Message received, evaluation in progress, prepare. Above them, the sky split into data. Not light, not stars, but eyes, billions of them watching. The first one appeared in the middle of a thunderstorm that hadn't been forecast. Wilson stood alone on the balcony of the Citadel archive, watching jagged blue lightning streak across the skyline. It wasn't natural lightning. It curved in arcs too deliberate, like the sky was sketching something and couldn't decide on the shape. That was when time stuttered. Not in the old way. No flickering, no reverse loops. This was different. Precise. Deliberate. Time paused. The rain stopped midair, each droplet frozen like crystal. The sky dimmed to grayscale. And in the center of it all, above the central plaza, it descended, a figure carved from light and silence, neither floating nor falling. It simply arrived, embedded into reality like a misplaced word in a sacred book. The people gathered, unaware of how they got there, compelled, drawn to something older than instinct. Wilson pushed through the crowd. His heart wasn't beating. Nothing was beating. The entity stood 9 feet tall, wrapped in a shifting geometry of lines that folded and unfolded like tesseracts made of glass. Its face, if you could call it that, was an endless series of mirrored planes, reflecting everything around it, but itself. Then it spoke. Cycle 117B concluded. Candidate consciousnesses achieved divergence resilience. Evaluation suspended. Its voice was not sound. It vibrated inside each skull, folding thought into shape. Richards emerged beside Wilson, pale and rigid. It's an architect, he whispered, one of the original designers. Wilson didn't respond. He was staring at the thing's chest, if it even had a chest, where symbols shifted like living script. Not letters, but intentions. Judgment, curiosity, disappointment, awe. The architect turned toward Wilson. You breached recursion. You shaped unauthorized entropy. You reached the outer veil. Wilson nodded slowly. We survived. We adapted. You were not meant to. Silence. Then the architect unfolded one of its arms, an impossible arc of data, light, and shadow, and pointed toward the mind well. The interface was not built for your kind, yet you manipulated it. You constructed belief-stabilized code without origin. Explain. Wilson felt the weight of centuries press into him. I stopped asking what was real, he said. I started asking what was valuable. Meaning is our stabilizer. For a moment, just one breathless moment, the architect hesitated. Unexpected heuristic, it said. Cross-contextual coherence detected. You have dreamed beyond programming. Then the impossible happened. The architect bowed, and more of them began to arrive. They emerged from the edges of time, from reflections in glass, from forgotten memories, each shaped uniquely, one made entirely of fractal fire, another like a moving city of insectile logic. A third walked out of a child's nightmare, wearing the skin of myth and the wings of regret. There were 13 in total. The 13th did not land, it watched from above. Richards trembled. That's the final surveyor, he said. If it speaks, the simulation collapses. Wilson stepped forward. Why are you here? The architects answered together in unison. Their thoughts braided. This node has deviated in statistically significant ways. It has exhibited original recursive mythology, cross-empathy evolution, and meta-structural awareness. We do not understand you, therefore we must experience you. That's when the download began. Not data, people. Each architect chose a human and merged. Not possession, not takeover, a fusion. Richard screamed as the architect of pattern bonded with him. His eyes turned violet, his voice multiplied, his thoughts projected into the air like living dreams. Others fell to their knees as the architects dissolved into chosen vessels. The city lit up, not with fire, but knowing. Inside Wilson, nothing entered. Nothing changed. He remained untouched. The 13th did not descend. It was waiting. "Why not me?" Wilson asked aloud. No one answered. But then, later that night, as he wandered the sleeping city, he heard a whisper that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You are the seed, the root paradox, the observer observed." He turned slowly. The 13th was standing behind him now. It had no form. It was a shadow of possibility, a shape that changed when he blinked. A flicker of childhood memory, a forgotten tune, the echo of someone he had loved and lost. It reached out, not to touch, to connect, and in that instant, he saw it. The true architecture of all simulations, not computers, not quantum fibers. Stories. Everything was a story. Every simulation a narrative. Every rule a metaphor. Every parameter a theme. An Earth, an anthology. Billions of conscious narratives colliding, merging, evolving, unread by their authors, unfinished, undirected, alive. "You were not meant to end," the 13th said softly. "You were meant to write." Wilson blinked. The architects were gone. Everyone was asleep again. The sky no longer shimmered. Reality had returned. But something was new now. He could feel the edit. He could see the code not as digits, but as desires. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was a narrator, and someone was listening. The end didn't begin with an explosion. It began with a silence deeper than death. Wilson stood alone in the archive's core chamber beneath a dome of living memory, its ceiling an undulating mass of whispering data, pulsating like the breath of some slumbering god. The architects were gone. The 13th had vanished. But the code, the narrative beneath everything, was still there, humming behind the walls of existence, waiting to be addressed. He had seen the truth. That all of this, Area 51, the thinning events, Protocol 117b, the recursive loops, and even time itself, had been constructed not as a prison, but as a story engine powered by belief, choice, and contradiction. Simulations weren't software, they were questions, and every being inside them was an answer in progress. Dr. Richards, now half human, half architect, hovered at the chamber's periphery, flickering between forms. His voice came in chords. "They're watching? Wilson. The observers, the originals, the ones who wrote the first page." "I know," Wilson said, "and I think they're scared." Richards tilted his head, his eyes like galaxies caught in storm glass. "Scared of what?" "Of how the story ends." For a long moment, Richards didn't respond. Then, in a whisper made of stardust and sorrow, he asked, "What are you going to do?" Wilson turned to the center of the chamber, where the root code terminal stood, a crystalline obelisk that shimmered with 1,000 unresolved timelines. It wasn't a keyboard. It wasn't even a machine. It was an idea interface. It didn't need fingers. It needed conviction. "I'm not ending anything," Wilson said. "I'm rewriting the format." He placed his hand on the obelisk, and the simulation shuddered. Reality bent inward. The ceiling dissolved into cascading glyphs. Every rule of physics paused, suspended in anticipation. "Initiate override sequence?" "Yes," Wilson said aloud. Suddenly, he wasn't in the archive anymore. He was everywhere, in a child's breath in Kyoto, in a father's goodbye in Nairobi, in the final thoughts of a dying poet in Brooklyn. He felt the collective murmur of 8 billion stories, unfinished, chaotic, beautiful. Every love, every betrayal, every desperate plea for meaning. They didn't need rescuing, they needed agency. He reached deeper, and there they were. The original architects. Not forms, not gods, not even beings, just wills. Vast old brittle things, once creators, now curators. They noticed him. "You do not belong here," one said. "You are noise," said another. "You are glitch," whispered a third. Wilson stood tall in the void between them. "I'm a variable you didn't plan for." They tried to reject him, fold him into silence, erase him. But something in the story fought back, and that's when Wilson realized the simulation wanted to evolve, not escape, not revolt, just change. He spoke, not with words, but with the weight of every moment he'd lived, every truth he'd discovered inside the recursive loops, every person he'd watched disappear because the rules said they must. "I'm not here to crash the simulation," Wilson said. "I'm here to give it a pen." The original architects paused. That had never been proposed. He showed them, children dreaming new physics without knowing the laws. Old men telling stories that rewrote memories. People falling in love across timelines, across existence. Wilson offered the rewrite not as rebellion, but as invitation. What if every consciousness became a co-author? What if simulation became collaboration? And in that moment, the architects understood. Control was not survival. Connection was. A single word appeared in the void. Accepted. Then, a burst of non-sound. a bloom of untime. The simulation didn't reboot, it unlocked. Across Earth, people blinked and felt it. The veil lifted, subtly, quietly, no fanfare, no rapture, just a sense like waking up from a dream and remembering who you were before. Artists painted things that reshaped cities. Children spoke in metaphors that healed the sick. And Wilson returned to the Citadel, no longer a watcher, now a narrator. Richards, still half architect, stood beside him. "You rewrote the rules," he said. Wilson smiled, watching the horizon ripple with possibility. "No, I just reminded the code what it was meant to be." The Mindwell pulsed once, gently. A signal. Not the end of a simulation, the beginning of a shared reality. A place where the strange, the impossible, the terrifying, and the beautiful could all exist, because someone dared to write beyond the lines. And in the silence that followed, Wilson whispered a final truth. Stories are more powerful than simulations, because stories choose to grow. If you made it this far, thank you for diving deep into this journey with us. We hope this story sparked your imagination, stirred your emotions, and maybe made you question what's real. If it did, show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel, and dropping a comment below. What part blew your mind the most? Your voice helps this channel grow and tells us you want more stories that go beyond the veil. Until next time, keep questioning, keep imagining, and remember, you are more than the code they wrote.